Hello, friends from around the world. Welcome. Not to the great debate. We're doing something different today. 20 questions. Before we get started, a very happy new year to all our supporters and followers around the world. 2020 was not the greatest year, not for any of us. But if we could end it with something optimistic, on the bright side, 2021 must be better than 2020. It could only go up from here. And if we're going to talk about the good that happened, at least for the page, it's been a great year for the Great Debate. First of all, it was the year the Great Debate was born. We had 28 debates. We had 15 interviews, including one with Noam Chomsky. We had over 144,000 views, and we involved thousands of people in the reconciliation process. And we're only just getting started. We're very excited for 2021, and it's great to have you all here with us. Today, I'm very happy to present 20 questions. It's our newest show. It involves people in conflict asking each other questions. Tonight, an Israeli by the name of Dani Iftach will be asking questions to Abu Zahir. Next week, the roles will be reversed, and Abu Zahir will be asking Dani questions. If you're new to this page, like and subscribe. If you really like what we do, support us on Patreon. Now that we're on the topic of Patreon, a big shout out to our visionary members. We have Trivium Energy, Pty Ltd, SOG Cannabis. So we have a green energy company and a cannabis company sponsoring us. Thank you so much for your support. And a big shout out to Max Marine, another visionary member. If you want to support us on Patreon or find any other social media links, you can find that all in the description. I am going to sign off because I am not on this session. I just want to say hi and Happy New Year. Without further ado, it's a great honor to, oh yeah, and we'll be doing an after party in the Discord, so you could find that link in the description as well. And without further ado, Dani Iftach and Abu Zahir, and signing out. Enjoy, friends.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Dani. I'm a 27-year-old Israeli. The questions formulated here today are inspired from conversations that I have had previously with Israelis every time I talk about the conflict. The goal of this Q&A is to debunk any common misconceptions, strives to educate its viewers, and really understand the Palestinian narrative, not only on their identity, but on the conflict as well. This is not a debate. I am not going to state my personal opinion on the matter. This is, to me, an educational segment. I, along with other members in the Great Debate community, believe that dialogue is pertinent to achieve any and all solutions, and in my experience, education encourages dialogue. It is our hope that this segment will educate its viewers and will encourage others to begin dialogue. And without further ado, I give you guys Abu Zahir.
Hi there. In a similar sort of vein to your preamble, I think, the point of these questions is to try to explain the narrative from the Palestinian point of view. I do think when we do these sorts of things, people immediately start thinking about like the political implications of what we're saying, and get very defensive. So my only advice to listeners is to just sort of keep an open mind, and try to pay attention and try not to see the narrative of the other side as a threat to your own. I mean, it's not always about rebutting what someone is saying, or, you know, even if you disagree, you have a different perspective or viewpoint of what the other side is telling you. I think it's important to understand that this is, you know, what your neighbors believe. I mean, this is what half the country that, you know, you're inside. This is their mindset, and so looking at it from that standpoint, I hope people can pay attention without sort of you know, going into that debate mindset. And I'll hand it over to Dani to answer the questions.
So the first question in this segment is, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel-Palestine originates back to the birth of the Jewish nation and culture, realized by the creation of the Jewish kingdom, most notably the Kingdom of Judea. Tell me about Palestinian origins, history, and connection to the land.
Yeah, it's an interesting question in the sense that whenever people think about, I certainly see people often like conflate Palestinian nationalism, when Palestinian nationalism arose, with sort of the history of of the people in the region. Probably the earliest history of Arab clans and tribes that are in Palestine today starts around the time of the Haidarite kingdom. So there is this sort of, in a similar sense to how you have, Jacob being the father of, the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
The Arab sort of like founding, myth, the patriarch is Ishmael for the Adonites. So we have this idea that, you have Adnan, and those are basically the Arabs that emerged out of the northern part of Arabia and the Middle East. So basically, Naqab, like Negev, Sinai, the Levant sort of region, and they're sort of the descendants of Ishmael. And then you have the Qahtanites, which are seen as the pure Arabs who emerged out of the Yemen from the south of modern day
Hijaz.
Saudi Arabia, later sort of and in the Hijaz. Arab itself is sort of a meta ethnicity. So you have like the Arabi and the Mustarab, the Arabized. So you have many different sort of groups and peoples that merge into that ethnicity over a period of time. But as far as modern day tribes and clans, and this sort of kept being reflected in the history of the region, even up until sort of the 1800s. So you have the Qaisi-Yemeni conflict. This tribal clan identity is still very present today. So people have maintained a sense of connection to these particular groups and tribes. And I'll tie this, it sort of ties directly into the history of the land. So if you begin with the Adnanites, with Ishmael, Ishmael had many sons. And so Al-Anbat, or Nabat, who is the father of Nabatians, and Qaidar, or Kedar, who was the first kingdom or tribal confederation, in a similar sense to kind of how the ancient kingdom of is the Federation of Israel emerged, and then later the Kingdom of Judea.
Could you tell me geographically what were the borders of the Nabatean kingdom, roughly?
Well, so the Qaidarites, the Nabatians sort of took over in a similar sort of region to the Nabatian. The Nabatians sort of took over to a similar sort of region to the Qaidarites. But you're sort of talking about south of Judah, so modern day, the modern day Negev in Israel, Sinai, and then when you go over to the Nabatian era, you're looking at like Petra, and they sort of maintain a similar set of borders. So it's that region of like Jordan, the south of modern day Palestine / Israel, and the Sinai region was generally where these people and these tribes were. You see then later like a migration of a lot of these tribes down into the Hijaz, and then obviously some maintained a presence in that area. I think the history of the Middle East in general is one of migrations and people moving based on drought, political war, different political situations and whatnot. But I guess sort of the origins of a lot of these cultures and civilized culture is in these regions, the desert areas of the Sinai, the Negev, and that was sort of like the early beginning of the Arab identity. The Ishmaelites descendants, basically through Adnan, then migrate into the Hijaz. There's sort of a conflict with the Yemenites and sort of a merging of identity, and that's when you get this like Hijaz era of Arab identity. And that's why people keep like referring to the Hijaz as sort of like the origins of an Arab presence in the land, even though Arabs have been all over the Middle East for a very, very long time. Now those same tribes are still there today, and not only are they still there today, but they are aware of their origins. So people are aware of whether they're from an Azadi or a Qahtani tribe, and indeed this was the source of a lot of our politics. Whether you have a lot of families that are from a Qaisi-Yemeni conflict, so they either identify as being Adnite or Qahtanite, and then you have other families that sort of pick the alliance, so kind of like the Barghouthis, who kind of come later, pick a side as needed.
Could you tell me roughly when the Barghouthis came to the land of Israel-Palestine?
The story is
any of the other tribes?
Yeah, so the story is something like, for the Barghouthis are a particularly interesting case. It's about 1,000 years ago. But I'd say modern day Palestinians emerge out of all sorts of different groups. Predominantly, though, you're looking at Adnanite Arab tribes and Qahtani Arab tribes, so they're predominantly Arab in their ethnicity and identity. And these migrations happen in multiple periods. So you have a period, a period of just, there's a sort of a founder effect in the region in general. So the population varied over time of, modern day Israel, Palestine. But you have tribes that are sort of maintained a presence on the land continuously, and even people who are descendants of, ethnically Jewish people that converted to Christianity and later Islam. You then have a Sassanid migration and obviously the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. And some of the clan mindset and awareness of your tribe is still a fairly prevalent thing in the region. So people are aware of the sort of clans that represent different areas. So, beyond sort of like
in the land predated the Islamic conquest. Some of the tribes in this land.
Some of the tribes predated the Islamic conquest, and different tribes were sort of known for different regions. So like Banu Ghassan are known for, a particular region in the Middle East and had a fairly prevalent sort of Christian kingdom inside Palestine, Syria, and a lot of areas in the Levant. Other tribes, are where some modern day Bedouins can trace their ancestry to. And you also have recent immigrants. It's not like you didn't have people come in through the Ottoman era or the Rashidun era, and significant population through the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. And different tribes sort of all know their ancestry and presence of the land. And the fairly notable families, most people are fairly aware of their origins. They say Danis, the Hassainis, the Tamimis, the Tuqans, the Jarrars.
So that leads me actually to my second question. Do Palestinians have documents or evidence that can prove their lineage? And do all Palestinians know their lineage or the history of the family in this land?
Yeah, so there's sort of two aspects of it. There's lineage, and then there's also presence in the land. So certainly, basically, since the modern day, like since the advent of writing, there's a lot of sources and historical sources from through the Roman and Empire onwards of Arab presence in the land, and these are sort of the same clans, and it becomes remarkably obvious from the 7th century onwards, where you have the Tamimis and sort of the very same clans that are there today, being part of the establishment of a lot of the buildings that you see before you, and that history kind of continues throughout the years, and particularly older Palestinians, so like our grandparents would sort of have some awareness of like, oh, this area in Akka was built by, this particular clan. The other thing about the clans and the origin of their names is they're sort of they all have different in history from when they splintered off from the previous clan. So you can take any clan and look at when they arrived at that name, and so the clan may have arrived at that name 1,000 years ago. The tribe is even older, and there's sort of this like history. So like, to give a brief example, you can go through like Qahtan. You have like Al-Azad is a big part of the Qahtani tribes, and then Ghassan, and from Ghassan you get a lot of Arab tribes that are there today. So the tribes kind of splinter as different key historical events happen, and they migrate to different areas and sort of splinter off. And this is sort of fairly common to a lot of the peoples in the land, including Jewish people who had a presence all over the Middle East. And so you have Jewish tribes inside of Arabia, and then changes to how people intermarried and did business with each other depending on which empire was around at the time. On the subject of sort of like kingdoms and whatnot, you have a lot of figures throughout the history that have a particular presence. Assassins are an easy one. You have people like Zahir al-Umar and a lot of sheikhs of different regions. You have to keep in mind the region is not this like contiguous map that we think about today. So, the clans that ruled over Jenin or Nablus or Khalil were different and moved with the different times, but sort of maintained that presence there for a very, very long time, and are very aware of when, these buildings and structures that you see today came to be. The other thing is the Fallahi culture, a lot of which was lost during the Nakba, because there were a very large percentage of the people who were expelled from the land. had a much wider concoction of different cultures and traditions and folklore. I mean, you have things like the maqams and leftover like superstition and practices that these people sort of maintained, which didn't modernize as much as sort of the clans did, where they kind of moved with the times. You have the Ottomans come in, so they adopt a little bit of the Ottoman way of thinking, and they did that with as each group of people came in. While the Falahin kind of maintained more of the older folklore, the older traditions. So you have a fairly complex and like diverse society, and it's not all Arabs. I mean, you have a whole bunch of different, ethnicities and origins. Not only that, but you have intermarriage. So when a lot of these tribes would show up in the land, they would marry into some of the locals. And so you get a mixture of all sorts of different identities and all sorts of different ethnicities that kind of round about, fall into this like Arab meta ethnicity, that we have today. But it really can be everything. Yeah.
So you spoke of two things that will lead me to the next two questions. So the people of this land were diverse, both ethnically and culturally. So when did the people of this land, of Israel, Palestine, start identifying themselves as Palestinians?
Well, there's sort of two portions to that. So there's like the first time people are identifying with the region and the identity. There's the first time when you start to have conflict, so like around the time of Muhammad Ali Pasha, where people start to see themselves as Palestinian, in that they were a bunch of people who fought together against a common enemy. And so, they start to refer to themselves as Palestinian people. But that was far removed from modern day Palestinian nationalism. I mean, there was just generally an awareness of the region being, Syria, Palestina, or Palestine. It was more a description of the land rather than a nationalist identity. Although the identity itself kind of gets woven into the history, in the sense that when you have modern day Palestinian nationalism being born, they sort of link it together to this continuous history of, these folklores, traditions, and relationship with the land. The Palestinian nationalism itself, as we know it today, sort of emerged, in the late Ottoman era, and then became quite pronounced, kind of like the late 20s, and then into the British Mandate period. And different families were instrumental in forming that identity. And it was really in response to a lot of things, partially a worldwide or particularly Middle Eastern push to become modern nation states. And then, of course, the impact of, both the conflict with, Zionist immigrants, and then later the Israeli state, and a sense of, a need to effectively define a nationalist identity, basically in an attempt to avoid being expelled from the land. So, I think that's sort of roughly when it starts to emerge.
So you spoke about the fact that Palestinian nationalism today kind of coincided, with the Zionist Aliyah, and Zionism in general. So a lot of Israelis feel that the Palestinian nationality isn't real because it was a response to. So what would you say to Israelis? Obviously, everything that we've talked about until now shows differently, but if you could say it in a sentence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's sort of assumption that everybody's going to have this like desire for statehood, is sort of where it comes from. I mean, it's like the British or like the colonial notion of terra nullius. I mean, you show up somewhere and there isn't a nation state, and so you go, well, there's no one here. Effectively, you just have different regions, and they were united in different periods of time, at different periods of times, under different sheikhs and different clans. But ultimately, there is no tremendous desire for a separate state. The people's attachment is to their land, and to the place that they had been for 1,000 years, 2,000 years, depending on the tribe and the people and their history, as well as a fairly inclusive culture. I mean, the identity, because it isn't ethnic, it's sort of meta-ethnic. It's not really up until the first Aliyah onwards, it's not really super clear like who is a Palestinian. It's effectively you're someone who was born in the land, you understand the local culture and the local way of speaking, you speak the same dialect of the language, and beyond that, I mean, these are the Palestinian people. There's just a general sense. I mean, even when Arafat was, in the PLO writing his constitution, there's the matter of like, well, how does he? You have this like conflict, and how he addresses the Jewish inhabitants of the land, Khalil, before the foundation of the state of Israel, and so he incorporates them to the identity. Probably the earliest emergence of that you start to see around 1911. So some easy documented examples are things like Palestine, the newspaper, which was sort of the most widely circulated newspaper at the time. And in some ways, it's sort of playing this alarmist role. So there's this awareness that there is a new, political movement of the land. This is still under the time of the Ottoman Empire, which is, built along ethnic lines. And there's actually a famous court case. So Palestine basically, took a lot of issue with the Zionist movement, and what they saw them as intending to do. And not everyone in the land really got that at that stage. There wasn't a, like countrywide awareness of the impact this was going to have on the people who lived there. There were certain families that benefited from it, on a commercial basis, and certain merchant families, so they didn't really have a particular problem with the immigrants. Newspapers like Palestine, through Al-Isa, basically started to make it very clear what their issue was. I think because you have this sort of like meta-ethnicity, it was very complicated for people to look at immigrants as outsiders. And so, there's sort of like the famous court case that happened in the Ottoman Empire. But even prior to the suspension, Palestine had a circular where they sort of explained that, when we said Zionist, that is not the same as Jewish. They were referred to Zionism as a political party, that aimed to basically create a Jewish state inside of the region, that it was exclusive for one group of people. And this is sort of like where they objected. Indeed, there's sort of like the conference between the Muslim Christian, association, where they effectively demanded something to the effect of people going to the same schools and then integrating with the local population as one of their biggest concerns about these like new immigrants, which they identified with this political movement. And this attitude, this sort of like alarmist awareness of the impact that the Zionist movement was going to have on the local population, after Balfour kind of got fulfilled. You have this period of time where this newspaper is being circulated, but not everyone's sort of buying into the risk. And then Balfour, in a lot of ways, was a vindication of what people like Issa Leisa was saying all this time, which was okay, look, they really are going to do this. And so you get an increase in sectarian violence from that point onwards. And so I think the nationalism, it takes an identity that effectively refers to, okay, sort of everyone who was here before what we see in our eyes as as an ethno-state being formed. If you're a Scottish person who's born in Palestine 1 or 2 generations ago, and you speak in the Palestinian Arab dialect, everyone will call you Palestinian. I mean, it is really more like it is more of a meta ethnicity. If you're born in the West Bank or Gaza and you buy into the culture and the idea and the way of the people, then you kind of get the meta ethnicity. People sort of started to recognize this particular quote unquote immigration as being fundamentally different to all the past, in the sense that it had the intention of establishing a state. And that's where all the concern was. It effectively was exclusionary, and that was the nature of what the court case was about in the case of Palestine, and why the nationalism was so important for people. I mean, you have this relationship with land and this place that you have been for so long. You have a new group of people who you're not sure how to feel about, and then suddenly you kind of have this like confirmation of your worst fears, which effectively their presence here is going to lead to your expulsion. And therein kind of, is born a lot of the Palestinian nationalism, particularly after the Franco-Syrian War, when there was a period of time where people kind of were expecting to be part of Syria, and certainly that's where they were for their administration of the Ottoman Empire. So post the Franco-Syrian War, you get the Istiqlal Party and a real desire for a separate state and a desire to like solidify this identity that really just refers to all the people who were here before a political movement they weren't a part of showed up inside the country. And that's sort of how they see it.
So you talked about the fact that Palestinians, prior to the Sykes-Picot, felt part of Greater Syria region. And it was only because of Sykes-Picot that they started thinking in the terms of independent statehood for the people of Palestine. This note that you made kind of made Israelis, or the common misconception with Israelis is that Palestinians are part of a greater Arab nation. There were no Palestinian people when Zionists came. And one of the biggest reasons that we see Palestinians as part of a greater Arab nation is because of the Arabization of the conflict. So how are Palestinians distinct or unique to this greater Arab nation?
Yeah. So when we talk about like the shift from wanting to be part of Syria versus, and people are kind of like thinking of modern day Syria today, but it really just is administrative. Ultimately, what mattered the most to people was that I can stay inside my land, the place that I have been for all this time, and effectively, what the Ottomans did so well was they sort of left us alone, right? The Ottomans collected their taxes, and whenever the Ottomans overplayed their hand, you would see revolts and rebellions against them.
Right.
I've mentioned Zahir al-Amr before, and I kind of mentioned him again, but you'd have periods in history where very powerful sheikhs and very powerful kind of clan leaders were able to establish a more or less autonomy, from the Ottoman Empire. Effectively when they'd overplayed their hand. And that was sort of the politics of the region. So you'd have different clans. Some clans would kind of ally with the Ottomans, other clans allied with the Adar and Umar. And this is sort of like the history of the land. This, as far as statehood is concerned, this deep need for statehood, like though there is a long identity, it sort of wasn't important. I mean, it is similar to most of the places where like, a European sort of modern mindset showed up to. When you see these different tribes that have these independent nations and no sense of cohesion, no sense of like modern nation state type cohesion, there is this assumption that like, well, I guess anything can happen. And there have been so many empires in the land. I mean, the Ottomans weren't new to the game. I mean, people were sort of, to some extent, this was almost, people were sort of used to it, right? You had the Ottomans, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, the Crusader period with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Fatimids, the Rashidun, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and before that, Byzantine, Roman. This is a land that has been occupied by many an empire. So for the local people who've been there, who've lived under the Byzantines and lived under the some had moved in after the 7th century conquest, Islamic conquest of Jerusalem and the land, or had been there under all these different empires. It sort of doesn't matter, who wears the hat. What mattered is my culture, my identity, and my people able to continue to be in this place. And it is why like the partitions were never going to work. It sort of didn't matter who was telling you needed to leave this place, because this place was your identity. I mean, forget like the big regions, Jenin, Nablus, Khalil, Gaza, like it was even more specific. I mean, you can look at the history of like throne villages, like all these different clans had particular villages that they'd like fortified themselves in. Certain villages were entirely their town. So, I mean, their connection to the land was both like, this is the only identity they had known, but in some cases it literally was like the origin of their family history. It defined their entire identity. So they could, they could give a shit, frankly, who was claiming the title of the governor of the nation state, so long as they maintain autonomy over their land. And this unity that formed afterwards, this Palestinian unity, came as a result of, okay, the administrative region we thought we were going to be part of, Syria, isn't a thing. We now have a new group of people in the land who want to establish a state, the same place that we are presently, and it's not an inclusive state. I mean, there's a few different attempts, by Ben Gurion to reach out and try to build something like a federation with some of the locals, and
Right.
it was a disappointing pitch at the time of the British mandate for the people who lived there. But yeah, for the most part, you have this thing show up in the country that ultimately doesn't include you. It doesn't include your identity. It's not the Armenians showing up. It's not a migration from a different. It's not an Albanian migration. It's not a Bosnian migration. It's not like a bunch of people showing up with a different identity or culture was new to us. It was just that this group wanted to establish a state just for this group, and people were immediately opposed to that. In fact, people didn't believe it at first. Palestine had to do its work to really convince people this was a genuine threat. And it was only after sort of Balfour that people bought into that. And you see a rapid uptick in sectarian violence and horrible events like the Hebron massacre. So that's sort of it. I mean, the nationalism is a way to. It's a qadiyya, it's a refuge, it's a way to save the people by uniting together and protecting this thing they have that they didn't really think they needed to fear losing. That's probably the best way I can sum it up.
Well, the East Bank is also historically considered part of Palestine. So why aren't Palestinians asking Jordanians for the right to self-determination? And another add-on to that question, and I think many Israelis have, is why not go to Jordan, which already has an overwhelming Palestinian population, and make it a Palestinian state?
Yeah, I think that's because the nationalism was. I mean, you're kind of. If you look at the borders of the Middle East, they are in some ways they're not drawn up along where these ancient tribes or clans had their history in. They're drawn up along whatever terrible ideas the British had, and different colonial powers in the region. So it's not so much about the borders. When it comes down to it, it's like there is a Jordanian nationalist movement that kind of unites Jordanian people. And the need for the Palestinian national movement was you have this other set of clans, families that are all going through the same struggle, the same, issue, effectively, expulsion from the land that they had lived in for hundreds, thousands of years. So there is the birth of Palestinian nationalism. It kind of defines itself around a particular border. So there's a lot of families in the East Bank that are very related to families in the West Bank, and even more so today, frankly, with intermarriage between the two peoples. But the identity is about a specific part of the land. Certain tribes are just from particular areas, certain clans are from particular areas. People are attached to their area. I'm from, and not only that, but you're talking about people where it's like, this is not thousands of years ago. We aren't returning to we're not talking about a place where we have. It's not about it being the source of our, the birth of our culture or the birth of our, religion or people or ethnicity, and sort of like, it's not just about it being a homeland. It's also like, we just like in some cases, like your grandfather built this thing. Like this isn't a long time ago. I mean, and a lot of the old cities, the old balads in Nablus, Akka, Nazareth, and all these, different areas. These aren't that old. I mean, a lot of these clans and tribes that are there today, they have grandfathers and great grandfathers who both fought for, died building some of these structures. So the history is quite intimate and it's very specific. It's not like I can go, well, I'm going to the Salt, I've got some relatives there. It is very much about like, this is the land that I have been in. This is the land that defines my identity. And this is where I'm from. So the fact that Palestinian nationalism has drawn itself up in the only borders that, ended up mattering for political reasons, sort of British Mandate period, kind of has nothing to do with people's connection to the land. your connection to land just comes from the area that you're from. It is why partition solutions still struggle to this very day. Because if you have a family that's originally from Akka, they're originally from Akka. They're not from. You can't tell them to go live in the West Bank. That's just not where they're from. And this isn't thousands of years old. This is 3 generations. I mean, it's your grandfather or your great grandfather. In many cases, a lot of these structures that these people are going through, it's just like there's some cases where people are still alive, like they actually remember being there. Some cases you have photographs. So this isn't a very long time ago, and it is very, very specific. And then as far as the identities go, it almost makes up entirely who you are. If you're from a clan, it's defined by your region. There's all sorts of great stories where a family in a particular region would leave, so they'd go to some other neighboring state. They go to like Syria and Jordan. They'd come back, and because they'd been absent for a generation, people would like rename them. They'd like rename their family because they've been away from the land too long. And your kind of status in the society, you'll have clans that are from, let's say, like Jenin, that have been in Nablus or Haifa for some number of a few hundred years or 300 years, and they still are totally considered to be from their original source identity. So it kind of like doesn't matter how long you've been there. This is people clearly know the area that you're from, the area that your group of people defines itself as belonging to. So it's kind of not something you can really sever any more than I could sort of tell Jewish people to go to a different region. It's like you go, this just is the area that you identify as your homeland, and it is the same thing for Palestinian people.
Right, but Jews don't constitute 60% of any foreign country, like Palestinians constitute nearly 60% or 60% of the Jordanian population.
I mean, at one point they did. I mean, at one point they were all over the world, right? Jewish people were in Iraq, they were in the diaspora. So you're mostly outside of the place that you called home. So the fact that most Palestinians are inside of, pushed to the side, it's sort of beside the point. I mean, it speaks more to, the ethnic cleansing that has occurred, and like the ethnic cleansing that has occurred over the last 70 years than where those people feel home is. Now, if a Palestinian is born in Jordan, identifies as Jordanian, that he sees that as their homeland, that's all well and good. But if they desire to return to the homeland, the same way that you have this like notion of aliyah, where anyone can kind of return to this place that is supposed to be their refuge, it is very much the same idea. I mean, it is just the same spot, and it is such a brief period of time. Like it'll be thousands of years down the line, people will still say, oh, I'm from this particular village in Jenin. You can build, you can kind of knock the village down. You can build soccer parks or stadiums over it, but it's in like people's last names. It's in their identity. So in the same way you have tomorrow Jerusalem, we have the exact same mindset. It's kind of never going to go away because it's just who you are. And I think understanding that, I guess, on both sides kind of helps people save themselves the effort of thinking that like Palestinians are ever going to accept, or Jordanians either. It's like it's not like you can put the East Bank aside and its interrelationship with the West Bank. Like you also have old Jordanian Bedouin tribes that have been in Jordan for a long time, and they have their own identity and they have their own culture and history. And though there is like tremendous love and tremendous bond between the two people, that's not the same thing as this idea of like al-Watn al-Badil. Like it's not al-Watn al-Badil. It's not. No one accepts it, not the Jordanians nor the Palestinians, and everybody kind of knows where they see their home as being, and that's. I think no amount of like political negotiation is ever going to change that.
So up until now, we've discussed the national roots to the conflict in general, Palestinian nationality, and the national roots to the conflict between Israel and Palestinians today. Just a second, sorry. This leads me to my next question. What do you think is the religious aspect to the conflict, and how significant is it? Because you said prior that Jews who were living in the land of Israel, Palestine, before Zionism would have been considered Palestinians?
Yeah, I think the religious aspect of the conflict is like, I personally think it's sort of insignificant. Obviously, you have two very religious peoples, and you have a lot of very important religious sites present in the land. And so all of our leaders appealing to the common kind of belief system of the people inside the country will lean on religious ideas to kind of like galvanize people. But it is more about identity. I mean, as far as like say the Islamization of the conflict goes, I think it, sort of along religious lines, they really wouldn't be a conflict. I mean, save for very important religious sites that people are concerned about, don't trust the other to take care of, and so there's a tremendously important desire to maintain custody over important religious sites. But I think in practice, there's no shortage of proposals to both like provide protection for these sites and also kind of separate them from the conflict. So I really don't think it's ultimately about that. I think what it really comes down to is identity. And so you have a Palestinian identity that kind of refers to like the people who were in the land for a particular period, and a different identity that refers to like what occurred from that point onwards. And so they're sort of two separate narratives.
Don't Palestinians in general in Arabic say Yehud? They don't say Zionist, and they don't say Israeli because for many reasons. But they use slander as slander, Yehud.
Yeah, I mean, if there was a meaningful Jewish population still in Palestine, I think people would draw that distinction. They would. It's just how people speak effectively. If you ask anyone to clarify, they'll clarify. They'll go, okay, I actually mean this group. I actually mean this particular ideology. But like, I kind of think of it this way: like, if there was 10,000, if 10,000 Jewish people like got up, started waving some Palestinian flags and like crossed the border, or had been like born in the West Bank and then had a Palestinian identity, spoken Arabic, had the Palestinian dialect, no one would identify them as any less Palestinian. And that is just literally the case. Like, we have other ethnicities inside of the Palestinian identity. It's not just Arab, and they aren't seen as any less Palestinian as any other member of the community, whether it's the descendants of Samaritans or the Armenians, or there's been all sorts of immigrant groups that make up a part of the identity. I think it's a willingness to be part of the collective and a part of the, I guess, the Qadiyya, or a lot of other aspects that tie Palestinian identity together, that really gives you that mantle. But it really isn't about. It is very much a meta ethnicity because everyone is very related because of intermarriage and whatnot. But it isn't as sort of separately and clearly defined as, say, like the Jewish ethnicity or ethno-religious identity, which was much more endogamous for a much longer period of time in history, and also has a much also brings with it a fairly terrible history in the diaspora, and so a desire to protect that identity. While I think there's sort of a willingness to incorporate people into the Palestinian identity that's much more present. So yeah, I think.
Would you say that most Palestinians or Palestinians in general are not anti-Semitic?
It depends what you mean. I think like the anti-Semitism that exists in the region is markedly different to that of anti-Semitism in Europe. I think it's more along the lines of the way the Middle East thinks in general, which is fairly tribal. So I mean, we don't just do it for you can go back in time before the first Aliyah, and so tribes would have grievances of the tribes, and they would have a slur for everyone from a particular clan because they'd had these past conflicts or bad experiences with them. And at some points there'd be a sulha. There'd be a moment where the two groups would reconcile, and so this previous way they'd felt about those people changes. I think it's just a collectivist mindset. I think that is the case in the Middle East in general. I don't think there's a deep ideological anti-Semitism. I think it's just literally like from the moment, from for the average Palestinian, that is their experience of, Jewish people. And it's only when they go into the diaspora or they have more personal connections, if they live inside of, areas where they do business with each other, they can start to separate those identities, and they do it very readily, like almost immediately. But it is more about the fact that it's a collectivist mindset, and so there is this mindset that the clan, the other group that is our enemy presently, that is responsible for what people see as all their grievances, is broadly speaking defined as Jewish, and so that manifests in hatred. It would also go away in the exact same way if the conflict went away. So it's based on history, and not only that, but there's many examples of this in the past. I mean,
So if Israel came right now to the Palestinians and said, I did you guys wrong, we want to help you, we want to help just find a solution in general to this conflict, this anti-Semitic rhetoric.
I mean, I think it would have to be genuine, right? So I don't think it's really about people's right to live in the land, or I don't think the conflict was really, without getting into the history too much, but I don't think it's really ultimately about like immigration or people's presence here, or even Jewish history in the land, or the desire to return to a homeland. I don't think that was necessarily going to lead to conflict, except perhaps along cultural lines, and so desire for integration and whatnot. But I think genuine. I think there is a narrative and there is a history that people are fairly removed from. So the average Israeli is not aware of Palestinian history, the Palestinian identity, or what people experience. And I'd say vice versa, but it would have to come from a place of like genuine justice. Which even if you look at like the history of like
What
tribes.
does genuine justice mean?
To me,
Yeah.
I know there's a much broader question. I think for a start, you start by acknowledging the history. I think that's the easiest part. And so having a common, narrative of what happened. It's one thing for us to see, the history of Israel through your perspective. But I don't think much of an attempt is made to do that on the other side. And the history doesn't begin at 48. The history begins from the first Adar onwards, and the interactions and the intentions of the people who had shown up there, and how that related to the Palestinian people, whether it was good intentions or unequal intentions, where there was sort of again, a very protectionist mindset, which is easy to understand when you look at the history, but ultimately doesn't. It doesn't make a difference to the people who were subjected to the impact of that movement. The people who were expelled from the lands, the people who were, the people who were massacred, or the people who were forced from their lands in the Nakba. And vice versa for the average person who, on the Israeli side who suffers from the conflict. It's the same thing. People kind of live in their reality. You can give me a history, you can give me a justification, but it doesn't matter. I think there's an acknowledgement of the history. Then there is a question of like what the current generation like feels about that history, and then some kind of an attempt to acknowledge it, write it in some way, and recognize people's connection to the land that they inhabited, and recognize what has been happening over the course of the last 70 years. I think there is a radically different narrative between both sides, and I know this might relate to other questions that you have, so I kind of don't want to get into it too much. But the basic premise of certainly in terms of like the peace process, Palestinians have sort of said fairly similar set of things. I mean, they've spoken about some kind of a right of return. They've spoken about I don't even think people really understand what that means, but we can maybe unpack that a bit later. They spoke about the right of return. People speak about self-determination, which can mean many different things. I mean, self-determination can exist in one state, it can exist in two. It just refers to the idea that I don't want every facet of my life ruled over by a government I don't vote for. My passport documents, my travel, the fact that at any moment in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m., some person can barge through my door, break my stuff, rifle through my drawers, or just be there to get a better view of the region, like to establish their presence, like the raids, the checkpoints, the incursions, but also that almost every function of a state, of a true state, not a municipal government, is being handled by a government I don't vote for. My ability to move freely, the documents that I carry, my economy, my banking, a large portion of my taxation. It's all held by this sort of like, we are like the vassal state of this entity that like rules over us, and so that's what self-determination is about. And then people speak about important sites like Al-Quds, particularly Al-Aqsa. So those tend to be like the three major points. It's like self-determination, a genuine state with Jordanian sovereignty. Whether there is one democratic state for everyone, or some variant of like 67 borders or something. But it really doesn't matter. It's not as much about statehood as it is about just self-determination, and then right of return. And beyond that, it's a recognition of identity. I think it is one thing to force someone into a position. So you can take something against someone's will. I think it's another thing to get them to consent to it. That's markedly different. People are willing to suffer quite a bit.
Palestinians have been suffering and have been, forced to accept things against their will around all Arab nations, right? You have the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and their socioeconomic status is horrendous. They too are basically caged into camps, are prevented from integrating into society, are prevented from being able to live a decent life. In Kuwait, 1990, they sent away they sent them in exile. In 1970, have Jordan and Black September. And so what Israelis see is that your Arab brethren, your Muslim brethren, haven't even accepted you, are doing the same exact thing, quote unquote, if not even worse than what Israel has and is doing to the Palestinians. So Israelis on their end go like, they are not even getting them, so why should we, right? What do you tell that to an Israeli? Your brothers won't accept you, so why should we?
Well, I think there's two sides to it. So I think there's a desire to paint it as a pan-Arabist, conflict, and so this idea that we're like part of a large Arab nation, like while we are Arab in identity, I think the experience of Palestinians in different areas is largely a consequence of geopolitics, and so whether it's the 70s in Jordan or their treatment in Lebanon, it is more to do with the politics of those regions. It says tremendously less about the actual people there. Arab culture is tremendously hospitable and has a sense of like brotherhood, and so while the people will treat you a particular way, the governments will treat you a different way. So there's a very large political component to it. People in general will kind of refuse to equate the two. You are ultimately showing up in someone else's country, and so how they treat you, even if there isn't as much of a push. It's still not the place that you call home. The place you call home is your home, and so there isn't the same tremendous push to be like, oh well, I want to be acknowledged as a equal member of the society. But I think it says more about the geopolitics, different governments, different political leaders of political leaders of these different areas than the people themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, Islamic regimes and Arab nations have basically taken over ownership over the conflict on the Palestinian end. And so you take ownership, and then not only do you not accept the Palestinians, that you've taken ownership over their conflict,
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that we don't like that. I mean, we have a sense of tremendous, tremendous love for the people inside Arab nation states. But I mean, from the establishment of the PLO, we've like reiterated as a people and as a sort of an identity, we've reiterated over and over again. No one has the right to speak on our behalf except us.
But they all speak. I mean, Israel doesn't hear what Palestinians have to say. Israel hears what, or Israelis, at least I hear what, another country has to say about the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at the history of the 48 war and onwards, I mean, you sort of have individual leaders and governments of different Arab states kind of participating in that for different intentions. Whether it was a slice of the pie because they were sort of coming in to invade, to take a piece of the land. You have the case of the 48 war where the Palestinian villages were disarmed by the Arab states that came in. I think the desire to paint the conflict.
Why were they disarmed?
Well, it was different cases. In the case of the West Bank, there was a sense that effectively there's going to be a new regime here. It's going to be under Jordanian control, and so there was a concern that people would rebel, like the Istiqlal parties would rebel against the Jordanians. Occupy is just as much, So there's a lot of ultimately for the people who live in the land. This is all much of a muchness. It's just like you want to live freely and you want to live in the place that you have always known to be home. What that state happens to be doesn't really matter. When you have foreign, leaders or governments with their own kind of like machinations, so long as those don't mean that you get expelled from the land, that you like those people, that you're able to relate to them culturally or linguistically is another thing. I mean, we could have done the same thing with Mizrahi Jews. They spoke the same language, they had the same identity, or a similar identity, an identity we could easily communicate with. So it's not just about the sense of like, oh, this other is here. It is that like one group was specific. First, the idea of partition, which everyone who fell under a particular portion of the partition was never going to kind of be on board with, because you're like, I don't want to leave this place this is the only place that I know to be home. And two, it's sort of like the history from the Nakba onwards. I think the Nakba began before the 48 war. There's an ethnic cleansing period that began, before a war even happened. We sort of see the war, particularly the 48 war, as almost entirely tangential. And a lot of the wars that Israel has had with other Arab states just seems to really not be our business. It has nothing to do with the people who live there. It's particularly frustrating when people have these deals on our behalf. And this is something the PLO has reiterated for a very long time. But this has its own sort of fairly complicated political history. Ultimately, for the average Palestinian who lives inside their country, the matters and the politics of other Arab states, who they share this like meta ethnicity with, has no bearing on their experience and their lives. These are foreign politicians sitting in a room discussing something on their behalf that they never gave them consent to. I mean, it's not even their pseudo leadership. It's literally leaders of another country, and they're just as happy to switch viewpoints as soon as the geopolitics of the region changes.
Okay. So when we talk about the Palestinian struggle, there is struggle for liberation. Israelis see this struggle for liberation as sheer terrorism, as people who celebrate death. Golda Meir once said, if Arab mothers loved their children more than they did, there would finally be peace. When we think of the struggle, we think of the terrorist attacks that have happened, throughout history in Israel, whether it be the Itamar attack in 2011, when an 8-month-old baby was, his throat was sliced, whether it be the Ramallah lynching, when the soldiers went in accidentally into the Shtachim, and basically were mutilated. And, you know, the most famous picture in the world when you think about the Palestinian struggle to Israelis is, you know, the murders of the Israelis who mutilated them, just, you know, waving their hands with blood. And you have this whole crowd just like, ha, ha, like, you know, and we're just, you know, obviously we don't share the same sentiment in that case. This is, you know, from an Israeli perspective. Or when you think of the fact of a woman in 2005 from Gaza, Wafa al-Bas, was treated in a hospital in Israel, and she came to she returned to that hospital and tried you know, to do a terrorist attack there. So we correlate struggle for liberation with terrorism. Is that how Palestinians see the struggle? Do you condone these actions? Do you condemn them? What is the Palestinian struggle?
I guess there's a lot of sides to this. This is like a sensitive subject. So from a humanist standpoint, like if you just like zoom out, you know, a child who gets shot by a sniper is just like completely innocent. It's like a deeply horrible thing that happens in a conflict. I think I kind of zoom out. Just first of all, as a tactic, like terror or guerrilla warfare, it isn't unique to Palestinian people or any other group of people. Whether it's like Lehi or Irgun or the IRA, when you have paramilitary groups, they resort to these kinds of tactics, and you know how much restraint they're willing to show depends on their ideology. You know, Irgun and Lehi had to splinter off from the Haganah because they did not want to show self-restraint, and so they operated in this like guerrilla warfare, you know, like terrorist tactic, because that's just what works when you don't have a equivalent army. As far as the horrific imagery in these like horrific stories, I think this is where like a lot of the narrative stuff goes, because it's just, you know, the same way you see these images and you see these attacks, we see an equivalent thing, and we see like children buried alive inside Gaza. Little girls, you know, white phosphorus burns that they will carry for the rest of their lives. You know, we see people, you know, get beat up and humiliated on a daily basis. Most people know relatives who were tortured. You know, or like teenagers in their local neighborhood, or when like a stiyah happened, or in the Second Intifada, when the soldiers would come in, they'd take them, use them as human shields, or tie them to a post so that you know people wouldn't throw rocks, because otherwise they'd hit the kid. Like we're kind of like subjected to the same horrific imagery. And individual attacks are separate to ideological attacks, like from a group. There's also individual attacks from like, you know, settlers, you know, like burning a kid alive or whatever. These are these are the same kind of like really intense, deeply emotional imagery. Is there on both sides. I think.
Yeah, but when Israeli individuals act against Palestinians, they're punished. They're not given the room to act on their own.
Yeah, I think when individuals act, I also think there's a media gap. So plenty of attacks are condemned by the leadership on the Palestinian side, or like our politicians or our spokespeople. They condemn them in Arabic. I don't know to what extent this message, you know, makes it across the media pond. But individuals are one thing. When groups do it, it's a different thing. And I think that is sort of like the market. That is where things get blurry, because effectively you have like, you know, paramilitary, guerrilla warfare, or terror groups as like formal, you know, institutions or organizations participating in resistance. The average person just doesn't. The average person just completely supports this, and it's not from a place of. It's not from a place of like. It's not from a desire to harm civilians. It's from a sense of, you know, people feel overwhelmingly subjected to disproportionate violence from a military force, and so like it's one thing when you're in an airplane and you bomb a house, you know, regardless of, you know, militaries can take greater precautions, so they can call a house, they have greater resources, they can make an attempt to reduce civilian casualties, but ultimately the number of civilian casualties is still enormous. So it sort of doesn't matter. whether civilians die in a conflict under the banner of a formal army, or a terror group, people see it as much of the same thing. Ultimately, they see themselves as being subjected to violence from a powerful, foreign or army or government they don't vote for, and then they find it incredulous to be told that they aren't supposed to resist that. If you feel like a child, you're just like. I think there's a sense that Palestinian violence is irrational, that people are violent because of, and part of it is the Islamic portion. So I think people kind of see it as coming from this ideological place that's like linked to, you look at like other terror groups, whether it's like ISIS or, sort of like the history of like Islamic terrorism. I think that's like so far removed from why the average person and why the majority of the people who kind of become these militants become militants. And it's like far more to do with just the stuff we witnessed, like with our own eyes, like growing up. It isn't something that's like inherited. I've remarked on this before, like this idea that we're kind of like, that we grow up in this like propaganda, we're told to hate, or, we're told to grow up to be, yeah. I mean, it's funny to me. I mean, most of these videos that show up on like Pal Watch or whatever, the average person doesn't see. They're like poor production quality and they're just kind of funny. That's not where the hatred comes from. The hatred comes from people's lived experiences. It's just what you see growing up. It's the relatives who have died. It's the people who were tortured. And then it's ultimately the ideological aspect of the conflict. You have an ethnic state, or an ethno-religious state, one part of the country that you're excluded from, that still exercises complete sovereignty over your life. The violence is not irrational. The violence is politically motivated. You might say it's a bad idea. You might say it's not the way to achieve your political goals, but ultimately it's politically motivated, just like the IRA, or any other, terror group or guerrilla warfare group in the past. When you achieve people's aspirations of effectively, civil rights and freedom, the violence ends. And I think the more people, there is a desire to portray it as irrational, like we grow up, indoctrinated. And it's just like, no, we don't. A lot of the articles that I read in some like Israeli media are hilarious to me. It's just like that they're so easy to. You can look up these textbooks that people claim that we're indoctrinated by. You can find them in a matter of minutes. Like we're raised in like fairly our textbooks and our education is like fairly neutral. There's plenty of like hilarious propaganda videos, but that's not why where the average person's sense of place in the conflict comes from. It comes from desperation. Mind you, this is still a minority of the population, because most people are just concerned about putting food on the table for their kids, and feeding their family. So most people, despite everything, still aren't in a position to be able to let it all go. But people in an extreme point of desperation with a politically motivated ideology, this is just what you're going to do, and put yourself in the same position.
So you're just going to murder a baby, and you're just going to.
Well, I think again.
I know that. Okay, so when you said that Palestinians see that a lot of children are buried, and this is true, Israelis see that it is collateral damage. You were talking about, how Islamic terrorist organization kind of have affected the way that people in general see resistance in the Palestinian case, right? And so on that note, you didn't call Hamas a terrorist organization, something that Israel and Israelis can agree unilaterally. It is a terrorist organization. We see it as a terrorist organization that hides behind its civilians. We see that when we retaliate or when we respond to Hamas attacks or to attacks that Hamas has taken ownership over, Hamas makes their civilians stay in buildings, go on roofs. We have pictures of of in the media, in Israeli media, where you see like Palestinian women and children on roofs when Israelis are going to attack, and sending leaflets and sending soldiers and sending and calling and all these things, kind of like, get out of the way. And then Hamas is telling them, no, go up the roof, stay at your place. Let's put bombs in your, under your bed or in hospitals or in schools. So Israelis feel like, well, what can we do? What can we do differently? So to kind of formulate my rant into a question is, do Palestinians consider Hamas a terrorist organization? If so, why? And if not, why? And a lead on to that question would be, does Hamas in fact use human shields? Do they really hide behind their civilians? Are the images that we are shown of women and children going on roofs, are these taken out of context?
This is fairly both a sensitive and like a fairly long question to answer. So I kind of like try to zoom out. I also try to speak as bluntly as possible. I don't think Palestinians give a shit whether you call them terror groups or not, because no one is happy about the death of a child. Like, no one, with the exception of, basically an extreme portion of people on both sides. No one is happy about that. I think you see a similar reaction in Palestinian society to Israeli society. You see a group of people, an extremist group of people that are, that will like respond. Say extremists, but like in a lot of cases, these are people who've just like personally witnessed conflict, whether it's Israelis that have lost their children, or Palestinians that have lost their children, that just see this as like a revenge attack. And that is a minority. I think what most people feel is people fall largely in this like collateral bandwagon, where they'll go, "Oh, it's horrible that this happened, but it is what it is." What were we expected to do, kind of thing. Like, there's this mindset of like, well, this is just collateral damage. I think that's kind of the reaction that you get. So first of all, I don't think Israelis, and even you can even say something about Palestinians, I don't think either side is aware of how most people in the other society react. We'll show a video of the worst version of the other group and vice versa. So we'll show a video of people like celebrating a bombing in Gaza, and you guys will show a video of some person being happy with the death of a child. This is not how most people feel. I think so. That's kind of tangential in the sense that, like, there aren't many people in the world who aren't psychopaths who are like pleased about the death of a child. That's not a thing. And I can just as easily point to like Israeli Jews that say something to the effect of a good Arab is dead Arab. You can do the same thing on the Palestinian side. These don't reflect the vast majority of both societies, and that percentage would be even smaller without the overarching kind of without the nature of the conflict. I think zooming further out, like the labels just don't really matter to people. You can call them terrorists, and you can call them whatever the hell you want, but for the average person, you kind of have to zoom out a little bit as well, because like as far as the West Bank is concerned, the resistance ended 14 years ago. There are isolated incidents, which, given the tremendously large population of the land, is still significant. A lot of people still lose their lives to those attacks. People struggle to care on the people on the Palestinian side struggle to care, given that like these incidents happen, but in the same way people don't respond as like collateral damage mindset. They go, okay, particularly given this isn't condoned, like the West Bank government has kind of like long since effectively become completely a part of a security coordination with Israel. Most terror attacks, or most resistance is being stopped by the PA inside of the West Bank, and they play a tremendous role in security coordination, make that happen. All these kind of raids. Is that
why the resistance to many Palestinians died 14 years ago? Because
in the West Bank.
In the West Bank, yeah.
Yeah, in the West Bank. Gaza's a separate story, for kind of like coincidental reasons. And to be clear, people are not happy about that. I'll kind of get into why people are not happy about that. And what resistance means can be literally anything. People kind of don't care whether it's protests or riots or terrible attacks. It kind of doesn't matter, because what it really comes down to is you kind of can't subject 5 million people to you kind of can't deprive 5 million people of civil rights, whether it's under their own state or a democratic state for everybody or whatever the hell it is. It kind of doesn't matter what your political solution to the conflict is. Some percentage of 5 million people are going to lose their fucking minds, and it isn't. It is like really straightforward, kind of how this like journey happens from the moment you're born to kind of like when a youth with a future, with a life, is going to choose to basically do something like this. Overall, though, the West Bank quote unquote resistance has kind of died down, not being a thing for the last 14 years. That's not to take away from the fact that there's still a significant number of cases where people get stabbed or incidents, whether that happens in the case of individuals or even attacks that groups like the PFLP or whatever will take credit for. So these attacks still do happen. Proportionally speaking, though, overall the security is quite good, and these attacks are infrequent. That as a coordinated resistance, the West Bank has kind of moved past that approach. Gaza has then over time been trying to shift to like a paramilitary, so kind of progressively trying to enter the mindset of being like a deterrent, and that's a little bit more complicated with the whole money for peace stuff, and there's some politics involved there on both sides, but it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, like, resistance for people is to them it's irrelevant what the context is. Whether resistance is armed or whether it's protests or whether it's riots, resistance generally means a refusal to accept the status quo. I think it's actually sadly the case that under the last 14 years that has largely been that has largely been sedated. People aren't protesting. There is a lack of political engagement. There's a lack of communication to the side as to what people actually want. People have no idea what the average Palestinian wants. And these like isolated incidents, it's not like they're not significant. I think we looked at the numbers the other day. I was like, there's like 30 attacks in a particular year. It's not that they aren't happening. There's plenty of these cases happening. It's just that they're a minority. And on the flip side, and they're not as coordinated as they were in the past. So it is relatively tangential to what the conflict is like in the second to father and in the past. I think more concerning is the mindset of people, because like on the one side you have these attacks. I think what you effectively have is a population that's kind of over the course of the last 14 years gotten used to a certain level of security, and a fairly like trying to basically live a normal life. And then you have this other group of people that they see as like wanting to hurt them or wanting to disrupt those lives, and they kind of like don't get why. But it's like horrible. So you're going to hear this occasional story. And on the flip side, you have another population, almost 100% of is constantly living out under military rule. And what that means is different things for different people. So there is an upper class that lives fairly good lives. But the average person has experienced, has been raided in a few times. They've had, most teenagers have been beat up, or most teenagers have been beat up by a soldier at some point in their lives. Most people who work and or travel, just literally travel across the country. Forget working in Israel. I mean, you're just traveling from different regions in the West Bank. You've gone through checkpoints. You've kind of been put through this kind of like subhuman treatment. Most people have some exposure to being under the military rule of another country, and that's one thing. Then there's another aspect of it, which is every facet of your life is defined by another group of people, and so a democracy you don't participate in, and so your borders, your ability to travel, your security, the security of your home, everything but sort of like basic civil law, and sort of like what you'd kind of expect like a local municipality to do, you see to like an overwhelming extent being defined by another government that you don't participate in. And so my ability to travel, my ability to visit different areas, my ability to sleep at night and not be subjected to like random raids, a large percentage of which are really just there to establish presence, or like, you know, fine, let the locals know that there's like that this thing is happening, or use, you know, different houses or apartments as like good sites for, you know, observing the region.
Mhm.
It's one thing if that was my police force. It's one thing if that was my army that was there to defend me. It's another thing where it's an army I don't vote in, I don't participate in, I don't have any relation to, that is just there to control me. And some percentage of that population is always going to say, fuck that. And, you know, people are going to get to a particular point in their lives where they've got nothing left to lose, and you're just
Mhm.
going to breed like 5 million enemies across your borders. As the question comes down to it, it's just like the violence is not irrational. I'd say the last 14-year period is remarkable given the situation. I am surprised that that the security situation is as good as it is. And a security situation isn't as good as it is because of the checkpoints and, you know, because of the wall. It's as good as it is because of like everything from Operation Defensive Shield onwards to fundamentally an ideological mindset in the PA. So Operation Defensive Shield was sort of placed second to father by the ADF, and then onwards a shift in political tactics by the PA to this like negotiation based approach. And I think over time this has become increasingly hopeless. The support amongst the populace for the PA is getting lower and lower. And ultimately, what it really comes down to is just like how long can a group of people live in this way, a way that you kind of just at the end of the day you wouldn't accept for yourself, you wouldn't accept for your friends, and you wouldn't accept for your family. Um, how long
Well,
can they live that way before, you know, people start protesting and then rioting, and then some percentage of the population that's lost like family or is basically fallen off the rails or hit a dead end is going to commit violent acts? Like Palestine is not unique in this. You see this in Ireland. You see this in Africa. You see this in, you know, the Black Panther movement. This is like a fairly recurring pattern. You have some percentage of people that kind of preach, "Hey, why don't we have civil rights for everyone? Why don't we just stop subjecting people to this stuff?" And you have another percentage of people that just basically just says, "Fuck that." You have anger. You have fish and just,
mhm.
and we also see it as disproportionate. I think that part is key. Like we just don't like we don't like equating the two as being remotely even, because, you know, some percentage of people are subjected to these horrible attacks, but we just see that as a minority of the other side, and we go like all of us kind of live through this life. Like all of us are under the control of another power. All of us live under, um, military rule. And it's crazy to think that some percentage of that population isn't going to go off the rails. Because that's what happens. People kind of just can't live like this, and we see this throughout all of human history. It's not unique to Israel. Um, and I get the complexity that this poses for Israelis, to understanding like their place in all of this. Um, but it is sort of human nature. I mean, when people lack political expression, this is the cycle that they go through.
So Israelis see that the situation with Palestinians today is the outcome of the inability of the Palestinian people to efficiently govern themselves. And again, when we think of Hamas, right, 2005, Israel leaves, the Gaza Strip, allows Hamas to govern, right? They were democratically elected or whatever, and their government uses human shields. Their government attacks their own people. Their government treats their people worse than Israel treat them. So that's how a lot of Israelis see it. So how would you respond to that perception?
I think it's kind of complicated. I mean, part of the reason why Hamas won the election is because of perception of corruption amongst the PA. I do think people have a worse notion of how Hamas treats people than kind of what you hear in the media. So kind of like going back to the human shields stuff before. I mean, we find the human shields argument to be particularly frustrating in general, because on the first hand, I mean, I can only speak for those of us who are in the West Bank, but we witnessed the IDF use literal human shields all the time. They'll go up to a neighborhood, they'll grab some kid, they'll use him to go from door to door, they'll knock, go Iftach bab, they'll get him to stand in front of the door in case there's somebody hiding behind the door who's going to shoot them or attack them in some way. They'll get him to do stuff for them, hide behind. Literally, they'll just grab a kid from the neighborhood who kind of seems old enough.
When you say Israelis use human shields, you're talking about Israelis use their own people as human shields, or they use
our people, so people in the West Bank. So they'll go into a particular area, they'll grab a kid. I say kid, but it's usually some guy who's a teenager, maybe like 15 all the way to 25. A lot of them, I personally know a few who are just like my neighbors, and they were teenagers. But ultimately, whatever, I don't think they really care. It's ultimately about grabbing some vaguely adult-sized body. You kind of go from door to door, you hold them. This would go on for hours. These were literal human shields. You get beat up. People have to strip and stuff, and people don't even like to talk about this shit. It's really not pleasant to talk about. There's no shortage of reports that kind of document it. The average person really doesn't like to get into the details, but so that is, in fact, I remember growing up, I assumed when Israelis were talking about human shields, that's what they literally meant. So growing on the West Bank, I assumed that when you guys were referring to human shields, you meant that Hamas was using literal human shields, that they were grabbing someone, holding them, and using them as human shields.
Giving them the order to stay in place before Israel attacks, or in protests, they sent women and children to the front line, or when we're about to bomb a building, they tell women and children to go up roof. That's what, or just hiding arsenals in schools, or in civilian buildings or in hospitals. That's what Israelis mean when they say that Hamas uses in civilians as human shields. Basically, they hide behind their civilians, and as a consequence, Palestinian civilians are killed as collateral damage.
And that's the part that and this is what I remember eventually reading, just being like, well, that's insane. It's not what I thought you meant when you said human shields initially. And when I found out about that effectively they were referring to the fact that, okay, there are weapons inside of civilian areas. First of all, this is a paramilitary guerrilla force. They're not going to set up a building with a giant red X on it, for the IDF to attack. The fact that there is a, Israeli military base in Tel Aviv, we don't say that that's Israel using Tel Aviv as a human shield.
But we don't send missiles from Tel Aviv.
Or you don't need to send missiles from Tel Aviv because you've got airplanes. I mean, I think it ultimately comes down to just it is ridiculous to hold. First of all, you have the most densely populated region in the world, and the idea that Hamas is going to store weapons or exist inside of a lot of civilian locations is then using them as human shields. I think it's moralizing. It's one thing to say, okay, they did what they had to do. It was a war. They just attacked. The moralizing aspect is the part we tend to find frustrating, where it's Hamas is using civilians as human shields. Hamas is a paramilitary group that runs the Gaza Strip, and so they are all over the Gaza Strip. Their stuff is all over the Gaza Strip, and they do not have the resources or the capability to develop, a separate military base. That's far enough away from a civilian site, so there's no possibility that civilians are going to get injured. Not only that, but a lot of these houses that would get bombed, it would be there is already an arms, firearm culture inside of Gaza. A lot of people have firearms. A lot of these places that would get destroyed, just, you're talking about people who aren't part of the paramilitary that have firearms at home that would get bombed. It doesn't sort of matter. It is kind of tangential. There's plenty of Amnesty International reports that talk about this, and plenty of people that kind of, investigate the discrepancy. I do see it as ultimately a desire to equivocate. We kind of live through literal human shields, and on the other side, you have basically the existence of a paramilitary group inside a civilian region, hiding stuff inside of a civilian region is then them using that region as civilian, as a human shield. No, that's just how you do paramilitary warfare. They have literally no other way to defend themselves. They're going to do this.
Do Hamas
particularly in the case
members
of the Gaza.
hold women and children against their will to like stand ground before Israel attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's as one of the more bizarre claims. I
Hmm.
haven't personally lived in Gaza, so I can't speak personally to this, but I've spoken to plenty of friends of mine, and that's like a very bizarre thing. I mean, people are generally told to rush out of the house and get the
Hmm.
hell out of there. Whether they receive a phone call that's claiming to be um, claiming to be someone there that's locally, and they kind of like put on a voice. But for the most part, people are told to get the hell out of there as quickly as possible. So that's not really a thing. It's not out of the question that this has happened before. It's just like kind of like beside the point. I think when you say human shields, a lot of people around the world assume that they're literally that you have this like handful of like terror members that are sitting inside a civilian home, and then like that like home gets bombed and it's like collateral damage. You're sort of imagining a hostage situation. On the most part, you basically just have, yes, they fire rockets from all over the country. Gaza is one of the most densely populated regions in the world. They are not going to set up a separate military base in the middle of nowhere. Um, the proximity of these of the military and the weapons to civilian areas is not, you know, is both not what most people think when you say human shields, and two, um, literally the only possible way that they could function. And the people there see them as responsible for being a deterrent, for being protection inside their country, protection against a force with overwhelming military supremacy. Um, and the other thing is, it's not unique, right? Like, you have headquarters of armies and military bases in densely populated centers all over the world. That you have airplanes means you don't need to fire missiles from them. But yeah, you have, Israeli army headquarters and Tel Aviv and Ashkelon and Beersheba and all over. I mean, this is the case in all over the world. And, whether or not you'll store missile silos in a densely populated area depends on whether you need to, whether it's strategically a good idea for you to. So I think it's one thing for the IDF to say that, like, what do you expect us to do? You're going to attack us, we're going to respond. It's another thing to do this moralizing thing where it's like, well, we didn't want to do this, but we had to because our hand was forced, kind of thing, by these people hiding in civilian areas. Like, in general, I find the moralizing on both sides to be like just kind of frustrating. Just speak bluntly, like, you took out strategic targets, you defended. You attacked because you were at war. I mean, this is language that people don't get frustrated by, but the hypocrisy is particularly frustrating, particularly the use of the word human shields, because we've just all, particularly, I can only speak for the West Bank. That's just what I experienced, but like human shields are just like a big thing around the time of the Second Intifada. So it's like really weird to hear the presence of weapons in civilian centers as being the
Hmm.
equivalent of that, the equivalent of grabbing a kid and then using him to protect you from gunfire or rocks. And then they're not the same thing. I think I've lost sight of your initial question there. I don't know if you want to restate that or move on.
I mean, you pretty much answered it. Just besides, another point was, who does Israel have to negotiate with? You talked about the fact that the PA does not represent the Palestinians in the West Bank. And I talked to you about the fact that Israel sees Hamas as a terrorist organization, illegitimate to negotiate with. So who do we negotiate throughout this process? Who do we negotiate with?
I think, like, first of all, I kind of don't want this to feel like apologism. Like, at the end of the day, in the same way that I say to you, like, okay, the average Palestinian citizen doesn't care that Israelis are like, well, we call the houses, the weapons are inside of civilian areas. Just like, at the end of the day, my daughter, someone will say, my daughter was buried alive beneath the rubble of a building, so I don't care what your justification was. That's my experience. I get that for an Israeli citizen, and you're like born there, you grow up there, and then one day, someone like you hear about your neighbor or one of your family members get killed in an attack. You kind of don't care what the political context. You kind of don't care why this attack happened. Ultimately, this is your family. These are your kids. This is your life that someone else is threatening. So I kind of want to put that to like one side because like that is the human element of a conflict. and there's sort of like no justification on the human level for this stuff happening to people who are a lot of the times are just kind of like that. They are collateral of the conflict. You're just like born somewhere, and it's your, it's the place that you're born, it's the place that you love, um, and so that kind of sits tangentially to the whole thing. As far as who there is to negotiate with, I think the whole concept of negotiation to me is silly. We are not a foreign nation state. I think, the idea that we're Jordan or Egypt, certainly Israel has negotiated these peace treaties with other Arab states. So I think they sort of think the Palestinians are similar. But we aren't a foreign nation state. There hasn't been, Palestinians don't have the ability to give Israelis peace. Since Arafat, there hasn't been a West Bank resistance. There's Gaza, which is like Hamas has been continuously willing to honor ceasefires, on the premise of you give us some deal and we'll do. I think there's even been pictures of like 50-year ceasefires. So the average citizen in the West Bank and people growing up in Hamas have no ability to give you guys peace. We think you guys got peace 14 years ago in the West Bank. In the case of Hamas, they are absolutely not willing to go through what the West Bank did, which is live under military rule.
Right, but Israelis see that when we negotiate, there is no partner. So you say that it's a funny concept, but at the end, that you guys aren't a foreign entity, but at the end of the day, Palestinians are seen as foreign to Israel. Israelis can't just unilaterally say, yo, this is what we're going to do. We need to negotiate with the people of this land. How is any solution going to be feasible without dialogue? And so who would we conduct this dialogue with?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need dialogue. You already know what people want. I mean, they've made it abundantly clear. You already know what Palestinians want. They want to be, ultimately, I mean, this is why we see the conflict as one-sided. Because, when it really, really comes down to it, if Palestinians had, civil rights and representation inside their own, inside the land, and there wouldn't be a conflict at all. So I think this idea of negotiation is still a continuation of the legacy of trying to partition land from the 30s onwards. Palestinians cannot enter into a negotiation with the Israelis simply because there is total asymmetry. What do Palestinians have to offer Israelis? They don't have anything to offer. At the time of Arafat, when there was a resistance, people spoke, well, we could offer them peace. And that is no longer the case. Take the example of the West Bank. There is already peace. There's been something close to 14 years of peace. You still have terror attacks. You still have people who lose their lives to that, but they are a minority. It's not a fraction of what was the case in the Second Intifada, and they're often acting alone, with some exceptions. You got the PFLP and whatnot. Certainly, the PA plays an overwhelming role in trying to prevent terror attacks, which people find frustrating. Not because, literally, you're talking about Bani Adam. People don't like violence. Nobody wants to lose their kids. Nobody wants to, live this way. But on the other side, it's just you have a population of 5 million people that have literally no other political recourse, and people speak about negotiation, but it's just they want the same thing that every group of people in the world wants, which is, to be represented by some kind of state that gives them self-determination, that gives them the same political rights as everyone else inside of that state, and then to be able to live on the land that they came from. And then to also not be forced to consent to the history that has happened to them. So it is one thing when you take something against my will. It is one thing when you subject me to military rule. It is one thing to be oppressed. It is another for me to sign a piece of paper that says, yes, I consent to this. I am happy with the history. This has been equal all along. Yeah, sure, this deal sounds good. It's why something like, the Trump plan is never, ever, ever going to work. The PA leadership could go and sign that deal. They can go sign that deal. And that would be the most likely cause of intifada. That would be the most
development of the land isn't.
It's not relevant. I think people think that the issue with Palestinians is that we live in poverty or the people. Yeah, the reality is Palestinians we're not the same thing as a lot of third world countries that you see. You have a tremendously high literacy rate. You have a tremendously high education rate, the highest rate of PhDs per capita, one of the highest rates of literacy inside of a tremendously high rate of literacy in the world, and I think a higher literacy rate than Israel. You have a very educated population, tremendous focus on tertiary education. You're not talking about like a third world country. People don't want to be sedated. We don't want to be told, we'll make your lives better in these ways. People want a sense of justice, and justice for them, I mean, on a minimum part, is just like there's an acknowledgement of the history, an acknowledgement of the present reality, and then it's just a civil rights movement from that point forwards. What political solution you use to achieve that civil rights movement is sort of tangential, but people are not going to sign a piece of paper that says I consent to the thing that has been done to me for this period of time. So the very first thing that piece of paper would need to acknowledge is the history that has happened. You can talk about the history of being involuntary. You can talk about like these governments acting and they had no other way, or they acted in the self-interest of their own people. That's fine. A lot of governments act this way. I don't think the history of Israel is unique in this capacity. I do think, though, that there is an overwhelming denial by the vast majority of the population of like what it took to get us to this point. And I think basically because of the actions of a few, I think it's kind of, it is similar to a lot of civil rights movements. You're going to have some percentage of the population that's going to take they're going to take a hardline militant approach. You also have cases like the First Intifada, where you have a coordinated, protest movement where people tried, and overwhelmingly the doctrine of the First Intifada was like riots and protests, and very specifically non-lethal, a non-lethal protest movement.
Albeit violent.
Yeah, I mean, people were throwing rocks, and those are kind of like the premise of the First Intifada. But the United Leadership that provoked the First Intifada really stressed to the people participating in it that they should not use lethal force because that would justify the use of lethal force on the other part. And what we saw in the First Intifada was, people's bones were broken en masse. The Iron Fist policy, where just like thousands of people were maimed in order to prevent them being able to get into protests again. We lost more lives than that we did in the Gaza war. So the reaction that we have had to non-lethal or to riots in the past has been more brutal than the reaction we had to how Israel reacted to Hamas. So it's not a great. People kind of don't buy into most of the avenues that are available to them. And then when it really comes down to it, people are also not going to accept, and people keep calling it maximalist demands. And I think part of it is a desire to paint Palestinians as being part of there's a sort of this phrase that, Israel won the land in a defensive war. And it's just like, well, you were attacked by every other Arab state, and the local population was there, most of which were forcibly disarmed by the people who attacked. You have a population that's just been in this place. They kind of see the conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict as tangential, and that have lived under it 7 years.
These Arab states are starting to, or have had in the past, some sort of alliance or peace with Israel. Take Egypt, for example, Jordan. Now we have, under Trump, peace treaties with the Gulf states. And so a lot of Israelis feel like we don't even need to cede to Palestinian demands. Palestinians are in no way, shape, or form in a place to have any demands. And soon enough, more and more Arab nations will ally themselves with Israel up until the point where Palestinians will just have to accept whatever Israel may offer. What is your opinion on that matter? What would you say?
Yeah, I think that, I just think that is a delusional mindset from the start. Like, the reality is, so the normalization of our other Arab states has kind of been, so like Saeed Barakat, which, death of her era, I guess, recently passed away. People saw that as the end of a 20-year period of this negotiations type approach to achieving stuff. And there were many chips on the Palestinian, the PA's, let's say the PA specifically, handbook. One of them was normalization with other Arab states. Another was sort of international pressure. There was no peace offer other than maybe increased security coordination, which again most people object to.
Hmm.
But the PA kind of does it against the will of most people. Um, but just a premise of increased security coordination. Those were the chips that they kind of had on their plate. Um, Presently, they have zero chips on their plate, and for the Palestinian people who are already to some extent saw the leadership as not really representing their views, really don't care. Um, they have the same demands, without any of these chips on the table as they did before. People kind
Hmm.
of people didn't really back this approach that the PA took post Arafat to begin with, and we saw this was kind of like unlikely to get us anywhere simply because we saw from the start that we had no negotiating chips. But I think I personally think this like two-state mindset is part of the delusion because I think it's like the opium. People have said this,
Hmm.
a number of articles. I think it's just this like constant fantasy that a country with like overwhelming military, economic, and political supremacy is going to choose to secede a large portion of their land on some kind of reasonable, negotiating field to a different group of people. I just think that's like
Right.
never going to happen. I think
But
the
a
status
two-state
quo is good for people.
solution would give the Palestinian people their right to self-determination. It would give the Palestinian people the right for them to govern themselves. It seems to many Israelis that it would fulfill nearly all your aspirations, minus going back to Jaffa or Haifa or Akka.
Sure. I mean, I
So
think
why wouldn't it be feasible?
well, in theory, it's feasible. I mean, I think like both leaderships on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side have been at some point in their history expressed some amount of support in the past. And this is quite a long time ago now. You are talking about like almost 15 years ago.
Hmm.
But support for 67 borders, two-state solution, East Jerusalem is like a Palestinian capital, West Jerusalem is an Israeli capital. It's so the usual kind of like two-state international law, blah blah blah. I mean, this stuff has been the rhetoric for such a long time. This is so far removed from the reality today, where you have deeply integrated populations
Hmm.
and deeply misleading polls. So when you have a poll that says that 40% of the population is on board, that makes you feel like this is a popular idea. As soon as you actually tell people what that entails, and you tell
Hmm.
Palestinians that they're going to be completely demilitarized, there is no support for that. You're basically asking them to just trust the group of people that they have been in conflict with this period of time, that they
Hmm.
see as having taken the majority of the place that they are from away, keeping in mind that most Palestinians are not from the West Bank or Gaza, they're from all over the land, to just trust them to not do it again.
Well, then how could
Whatever.
Israelis trust Palestinians?
Well,
Just the
and it
same
goes
way,
vice versa. Yeah,
you
it
know.
goes vice versa. On the Israeli side, when you see let's say take the case of East Jerusalem, you see the
Hmm.
polls drop tremendously in numbers from like 40% to 10% when you explain that like the site that they consider to be extremely important to them, Palestinian side Al-Haram al-Sharif and the Temple Mount, the Israeli Jewish side is going to be on is going to be under the control of the other side. There is tremendously low support for that. And so there is this idea that, on the one hand, people go, okay, a decent number of people kind of support the two-state solution, but you kind of examine the polls further, and it's a tremendously low number. And that number is sort of the lowest it's ever been. The difference is basically Israelis say two states, we see like 1.2 states. We effectively see, clearly an Israeli state plus like a bunch of Palestinian Bantustans, where we will have no
Hmm.
control over our borders, no control over our, you know, effectively no meaningful sovereignty economically, and then just a promise that if you guys really, really behave, we'll give you more. And the reality is, it's just like that is how you negotiate with a
Well,
foreign
I mean, it's
party.
kind of like the US and Japan, right? Like the US sent 2 atomic bombs to Japan, then was just like, my bad, but you cannot have an army. I will give you a security umbrella and you will prosper in other areas. So if we give the Palestinian people a state and say, okay, you guys can't be militarized now until we trust you,
Yeah, I
why
think the
is
Japanese.
that an
I,
accept?
Yeah, I think the Japanese didn't live under American military occupation for as long as Palestinian people did. It's just like, I also think, I mean, if you look at the history of the treaty with Japan, that was a tough deal to sell because there's this in the Japanese mindset. But also, Japan had a defense force. So, despite the fact that on paper they weren't supposed to, I kind of don't want to get into the details of like the political machinations of a two-state solution. I think it's beside the point. This is now my personal opinion. I think I think the whole idea is a fantasy. There is no political incentive. I don't think it's politically relevant to Israelis today. I think if you live in Tel Aviv, you are far enough away from the conflict that it's not particularly relevant to you. I think the last 14 years has created the delusion that this thing can continue. And you are basically relying on the ability of Arab leaders to keep their people in check, to guarantee your safety. And at some point in history, and I think that point is, I mean, I'd be surprised if it continues post the Abbas administration. I think there's almost no chance of it continuing post the Abbas administration. As soon as the status quo breaks, you just have 5 million neighbors that we aren't in another country. We're not Jordan or Egypt. We are completely integrated. I mean, you're talking about people who cross the border every day to work in the other country and vice versa. Settlements are, within eyesight of each other. These people are not far away. We are not another country. It feels like we're in another country if you're in Tel Aviv. For the people who live in the settlements, people who live in Ariel, the people who live in Jerusalem, we are right next to each other. The populations are completely embedded. They're economically embedded.
But they're not incorporated. Yeah. So
they're just not enfranchised.
They're just not what? I'm sorry?
Enfranchised. So there's...
I
mean, legally speaking. So what the political solution ends up being...
And that's important. That's important, right? Your legal status. So the fear is incorporating Palestinian into Israel-Palestine would basically, be a demographic... sorry. I got a call. Sorry, back on top. So basically... incorporating Palestinians into Israel could be seen as a demographic threat and also a huge antithesis to the notion of a Jewish state and its preservation. How would you address to each and every Israeli and Jew that shares this grave and existential concern that it would be possible to have two nations incorporated into one land?
Yeah, I mean... I think the much more interesting political solutions that people have discussed. I don't want to get into the details of any of them, but there's things like confederations or federations with freedom movement and sort of separate demographic or electoral jurisdictions that kind of allow you to achieve constitutionally address constitutionally most of these concerns. I personally don't think that's really the hard part. I think the hard part is getting people to give a shit, frankly. I mean, you're dealing with economic problems, you're dealing with fourth election, and there's enough national problems at home for most Israelis that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is very low on their minds. Then there is this era of PA security.
Well, they're low on their mind because right now we have the upper hand. There is a status.
Yeah, and I do think every time people characterize in the term of like two countries of war, it's like deeply misleading. Like the PA overwhelmingly cracks down on. I mean, you guys see this rhetoric, but they like overwhelmingly are responsible for the arrests of most, militias or resistance groups inside the West Bank. So the PLA have been keeping things quiet. Ultimately, you are talking about 5 million people that are completely embedded inside the exact same border. You guys draw Eretz Israel, we draw Eretz Palestine, it's the exact same map. These people are almost completely integrated with each other. Gaza is blockaded, so it's cut off separately. The West Bank is almost completely integrated. I mean, we cross the border constantly. The wall is a joke. I mean, every single person can get it. The wall has absolutely no impact. People's ability to cross the border. The thing that keeps the country safe is the military and the security apparatus on the Israeli side, as well as, and then to a separate extent, and this varies different periods of time, the PA security apparatus. And this is maintenance of a status quo. And you're just asking the question of how long it's going to take for 5 million people to erupt. And the answer is just like, inevitably history tells us that at some point they will. And then the other question is just like, does what those
So that
people
would be our
want?
incentive. That would be my last question to kind of like wrap out what we're talking about
Yeah,
now.
go ahead.
Would that be Israel's incentive to basically fulfill Palestinian aspirations? Is the fact that we can turn a blind eye to 5 million people who are living in the land of Israel, Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sides to it. I mean, the first aspect of it is non-existential. So what Palestinian
Mhm.
aspirations are, for you living there, they don't have to pose a threat to your life or to your culture or to the fact that this is your homeland as much as it is our homeland. Um, uh, you know,
They don't have to, but do they? Like, would they?
well,
Palestinians and Israelis living in one state, federation, whatever, one land, Israelis and Palestinians side by side, would the preservation of the Jewish people
I
be
mean, as
threatened?
soon as, and this goes back to sort of everything I said
Mm-hmm.
earlier. Palestinian violence is not coming from an irrational place. It's a fairly simple narrative of just like, what options do we have? When people see other recourses, they're willing to try those other recourses. When they don't have other recourses, it kind of goes through this escalation process, like every other group of people in the world, and until it gets to paramilitary or terror groups. It really is as simple as like the reason the hatred exists is because of what people have lived through, as well as the history. If there is a reconciliation moment of acknowledging the history, as well as an equity moment of providing people with an equal society to live in, then there is no conflict. I mean, if we all lived inside a state where everyone had equal civil rights, whether it's under two or a federation or confederation or one state, there would be no conflict today. I mean, because there'd be no reason for there to be a conflict. And I think that's sort of the point. Um, and I think that is what people sort of need to get. Like ultimately, you can either live side by side with 5 million people with this like
Mm-hmm.
70-year long vendetta, or you can just you know uh, a try to understand what the narrative of the other side is, even if you don't agree with it, even if you don't agree with everything I said, and then realize that what those people want doesn't pose a threat to your
Mm-hmm.
life in any way, your culture or your society, and b probably will provide, like, it's probably better for all the people that exist inside the country, whether it's economically, culturally, or from a security standpoint, or even from a cultural standpoint, from a sense of your own sense of being, like how you feel about your own country and your own history, the history of how your country came to being. Like, I understand that for Israeli Jews, the state is a fulfillment of a dream, and for us, it's we see the flip side of that as a nightmare. And so it's the ability to take that history, and come to terms with every part of it. Um, and it's the same thing on our side. I just don't think that the fulfillment of Palestinian aspirations um, is an existential threat, and that is sort of the mindset. People, I think most people get that they kind of can't control 5 million people indefinitely, but at some point it'll go the way of like Sex Simpa Tyrannas. You just literally cannot relive the people for that long. But they feel like they don't have another choice, and that's the part that baffles me, because it's like what these people want is the same thing that all people want. Um, yeah, it's just freedom, self-determination, political rights, participation, enfranchisement in some kind of a government that represents them, and that they refuse to consent to something which they see as unjust. And so long as you try to negotiate with Palestinians from a place of asymmetry, as if we're another country that's been dominated militarily, the problem is we're not another country. We don't have a military. We don't have a clear sense of like, oh, well, we were in a war and we lost. Um, it feels a lot more like a civil rights struggle to us, and increasingly more as time passes. Um, and so it's not convincing to tell them just like, well, suck it up,
Mm-hmm.
because people won't really accept anything that's not coming from a place of equity. That's not coming from actually a place of, there kind of can't be a cold peace in my view. There kind of needs to be a warm peace. So there needs to be a recognition that the person on the other side is another
So
human
there is
being.
a possibility of warm peace.
Than
There is a possibility of forgiving.
I think the only peace is war and peace. What that means is different things to different people.
Mm-hmm.
But war and peace isn't pushing this other group of people as far away as possible and thinking that, like, well, if you're in Tel Aviv, and the settlers, the settlement cities can just fend for themselves, that you won't have to worry about it under a two-state solution. I think it's actually understanding how these people have seen the world over the course of the last 70 years, and then immediately treating their rights the way you treat your own. And as soon as you do that, those people will see the same thing about you. It's just that has not been what the history has been to date. If we have been talking about understanding each other's narratives or equal rights of people for the last 70 years, I don't think that would be an issue. I do see there is this ideological problem that is inherent to at least the history of Zionism to date, which is quite fixated on, like, A, demographics, and then B, the safety mindset that comes from being a minority in the diaspora for so long. Like, you are not a minority here. You are half the country. This isn't diaspora Europe. This isn't diaspora Middle East. You're here. It is what it is. We feel the history has been our tragedy, and I can see how on the flip side it's a fulfillment of a dream. And now the next thing is just reconciling those two histories, because those two things are both simultaneously true, and they kind of don't pose a threat to each other, because you were just talking about human beings that live inside a country that want to see their identity protected and fulfilled, and that's exactly what both sides want. And as soon as you can shatter that mindset, like, what does a Jewish state mean to you? Does it mean a place where you are safe, a place that's your homeland, a connection with your history and your culture, that's, that you're trying to reconnect through from thousands of years of being cast down the diaspora? Or does it fundamentally mean an ethno-state where only, people of this identity get rights? Because that's how we see it. We see Israel as a state that exclusively grants first-tier citizenship to, Israeli Jews. I appreciate that Arab Israelis have, legally most civil rights, but you still ultimately have a Jewish nation state law. And then that's Arab Israelis who are still enfranchised, who still can vote. For us, we see most actions of a state and most important aspects of our lives being administered by a government we don't vote for on land that we consider our own. And then all you need to do is extend the hour to include us, and we'll extend the hour to include you. I really think it's that simple. And that is why I'm hopeful to some extent. Because if you can get people to really engage, like, push past the bullshit, the average citizen really doesn't care what the ideological justification. They will just tell you what they lived through and what they experienced and why they feel the way they do at the other side. And I am hopeful that there is a way forwards, in the sense that when you're able to put aside these ideological differences, these ideological constraints, and really think about what you want, whether you're someone who's born here or who immigrated here under Aliyah, or whatever your story inside this land is, what is the threat of giving the people that you are, like, literally totally embedded with equal rights? And then if you don't do that, then what is the alternative? And so long as this is a desire to negotiate from asymmetry rather than both acknowledgement of the other side's narrative and parity, I don't think you're going to get any way forwards, because you can convince a leader, but you can't convince a people. Like Seychellen monkeys, we know when something is unfair. People will hudna, they will temporarily wait out something they see as unjust, but they will never endure it indefinitely. And so, the moment you see the other side's rights as important as your own, then you have your political solution like that. And I think that goes for both people. I hope that in some way answers your question.
I mean, it does. I think you've answered most of my questions, and you've given me hope by the end of this segment. So kudos for you. I really want to thank you for taking the time to answer these questions. I'm sure some of the questions that I asked were infuriating, but I felt it pertinent to ask questions that were raw and real and that exist in Israeli discourse and, conversation when talking about it. I really hope that the Israelis here that are watching this, I hope you've learned something. I hope you guys really take, what Zahir is saying and understanding that their narrative, the Palestinian narrative, isn't a threat or doesn't have to be a threat to the Israeli narrative. I hope Israelis can understand that Palestinians are people and people of this land. And yeah, that's my message for, closing 2020 and opening 2021. Just stay hopeful and open-minded.
Thank you both so much. Zahir, did you want to have some final thoughts before we wrap it up?
I would basically say Happy New Year to everyone, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. I think we could do a segment on each of these questions by themselves. I don't think I did any of them justice, but I hope
I actually think
I was able to communicate my narrative.
I personally learned a lot. I think it was very inspiring, and just the beginning. And in all honesty, this conversation is meant to continue in the after party if you two still have energy. For those watching, and if you're not in our Discord, join our Discord. We're going to continue the conversation in the lounge. It's a voice, video, and text conversation similar to this, but anybody watching can also contribute with voice. Can one of our awesome community members please drop a Discord link? Awesome. This was super inspiring, Zahir. Dani, thank you. Next Wednesday, we're going to switch the roles. Zahir will be asking Dani 20 questions, 7 p.m. Jerusalem time. Very exciting. And honestly, I think this was a great way to end a challenging year. To those who struggled this year, I feel you. It wasn't easy for any of us. I have a feeling 2021 is going to be brighter than 2020. And I think together in 2020, if we look what we've accomplished here as a community, it's been tremendous. Many people, myself included, have been inspired and energized by these dialogues. The reconciliation process is well underway, and it will only continue. Anyone new to what we're doing here, it's really great to have you. And we love when new members join our community. We have conversations around the clock in Discord and a few times a week here on YouTube. So we'd love if you joined us. And with that, friends, signing off.